Right, so section 2, critique of the relation between man and the technical object as it is presented by the notion of progress arising from thermodynamics and energetics, recourse to information theory. Within man, what can be in a relation with the individualized technical being is the intuition of the schemas of functioning. As a being who participates in its regulation, man can be coupled to the machine as an equal, and not merely as a being who directs or utilizes it through the incorporation of ensembles, or as a being who serves it by supplying matter and elements. By this we mean to say that neither an economic theory nor an energetic theory can account for such a coupling of man and machine. Economic or energetic links are too external for it to be possible to define this true coupling through them. There is an inter-individual coupling between man and machine when the same self-regulating functions are better and more subtly accomplished by the man-machine couple than by man or machine alone. Let's take the case of what we call memory. Leaving aside all the mythological assimilations of vital functions to artificial operations, we can say that man and machine present two complementary aspects of the use that is made of the past. The machine is capable of retaining monomorphic documents that are very complex, richly detailed, and precise for a very long time. A magnetic tape, 300 meters long, can keep a recording of the magnetic translation of any noise or sound in a bandwidth of 50 to 10,000 hertz, corresponding to about an hour's listening time, or 2 hours if one accepts a reduction of the frequency band to an upper limit of 5,000 hertz. A roll of film of the same size can record scenes that take about half an hour to play, with a definition of about 500 lines, that is to say, in a way that makes it possible to distinguish about 250,000 pixels on every image. Magnetic tape can thus record 3,600,000 sonic events, each one distinct from the others. Cinematographic film stock can record 120 million pixels, each one distinct from the others. The difference in these figures does not derive solely from the fact that the grain of a magnetic strip is larger than that of the sensitive film. In fact, it is of the same size. It comes primarily from the fact that the recording of sound corresponds to a linear track on tape, whereas the recording of images corresponds to the splicing of successive surfaces, in which almost every one of the sensitive pixels can become a carrier of information. Now, what characterizes the conservation function of this machine is that it is absolutely without structure. Film does not record clear-cut figures, geometrical images, for instance, any better than the disordered images of grains in a pile of sand. To a certain extent, the vivid oppositions of clear-cut surfaces are even less well recorded than the disordered uniformity of the grains of sand, because of the phenomena of light diffusion in the film base, which creates the so-called halo effect around very bright and clearly delineated areas. Similarly, magnetic tape does not record continuous and well-formed musical sounds any better than transitional tones or noises. There is no order in the preservation of recordings by the machine, which does not possess the faculty of selecting forms. Human perception distinguishes forms, perceptual units, when looking at or listening to recorded documents. But the recording itself does not really contain these forms. The inability of the data-preserving function of the machines is relative to the recording and reproduction of forms. This incapacity is general. It exists at every level. A considerable intricacy is needed in order for a calculating machine to be capable of writing results in clearly legible figures on a cathode ray tube screen. The numeroscope is made of very delicate and complex combinations using encodings in order to obtain lines that can somehow reproduce numbers. It is far easier to reproduce Lissajous figures than to write the number 5. The machine cannot retain forms, but merely a translation of forms by means of an encoding in a spatial or temporal distribution. This distribution may be very durable, like that of a magnetic tape, definitive, like that of silver grains in chemically sensitive film, or altogether provisional, like that of the series of pulses passing through a mercury column with a piezoelectric crystal at each end, used in certain types of calculating machines for the preservation of partial results during the course of the operation. It can also be very fleeting but sustained, as in the case of the recording of numbers on a mosaic in a certain type of cathode ray tube, somewhat like the iconoscope, and equipped with 2 electron guns, one for reading and inscription, the other for upkeep. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology RCA Selectron and Storage Tube. The plasticity of the support must not be confused with the true plasticity in the recording function. It is possible to erase the numbers inscribed on the beryllium mosaic of the selectron to the thousandth of a second, and to replace them with others. But the speed with which successive recordings succeed each other on the same support is in no way means that the recording, the speed with which the successive recordings succeed each other on the same support in no way means that the recording itself is plastic. Each recording taken in itself is perfectly rigid. It is obviously possible to erase the magnetization of the oxide grains from the magnetic strip in order to make another recording, but the new recording is completely separate from the preceding one. If the first is poorly erased, it interferes with the next recording, blurring it rather than facilitating it. So that was a bit long, but the idea that he's going to be developing in this section is the mode of coupling between a human and a machine when both are at the level of the individual. So what sort of relationship, how is a person and a machine linked together? And so he's starting with the example of memory and the way that machine memory or recording differs from human memory and recording, and how the two are related to each other. So he's pointing out here about the ways that mechanical or electronic recording, it doesn't select forms. It just records sort of pure input. It doesn't have any sort of structure to what it records. Whereas human memory, as we'll continue to see as we go along, human memory remembers structures of scenes or events or visual representations or whatever it is. So there's a sort of correspondence. The human memory and machine memory sort of correspond to each other in they select different aspects of a scene or of something to be recorded.
It's interesting to me how that's kind of blurring today when you think about how machine learning is now capable of kind of perceiving scenes and labeling the things that it sees in it semantically. So it sounds like, this distinction that he's drawing here, obviously over the course of time, is kind of beginning to blur, I think. No, I'm done. I'm done. I guess the other thing to say with that, I wonder whether, like, even the way that we think about image compression these days, right, where like deriving something from a scene, whether it's like compression, like a JPEG or something like that, functions, primarily on the basis in which Simondon is describing this, where there's a certain amount of information in the scene, and it's irrespective, and there's no form to be had, and yet compression is this thing where we are kind of imposing a kind of perceptive selectivity on things, and sort of saying, if the computer sees a patch of color that's more or less uniform, then you can represent that with less information than you would if something was more striated or more complicated as an image. So again, that things are kind of blurring in today's computing environment.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to make. Like the recording media that he's describing here, whether it's film or magnetic tape and different things like that, they're all sort of passive recording mechanisms. It's just something that is impacted by light or sound or whatever it is, and then it's just transformed passively. Whereas the types of processes that you're describing, like compression or the visual systems that can label visual items and things like that, these are all more active. It involves actual processing of the input and not just a sort of passive storage.
And yet somehow it's sort of premised on what he's describing, right? Like it's sort of that sort of division between, I just find it interesting that there's, how did the techniques come to intervene in such a way that line could begin to have been blurred. It's interesting to kind of roll the tape forward on his thinking here.
Yeah, and the more advanced visual recognition systems, they do involve machine learning, which has to be trained by inputs, right? Like you input labeled set of, like, here, this is what cars look like. These are pictures with cars in them or something like that. And then you give an unlabeled set, and you get the system to sort the set into pictures with cars and pictures without cars. So it revolves around, or relies on, the input that uses the human capacity to make that structuring or sort of sorting operation on the perceived input. So it's sort of in one sense, this distinction is sort of broken down. The distinction that he's making now is more broken down, but in another sense, it's still relying on that same sorting capacity to, like human sorting capacity is just being sort of trained into these machine learning systems.
Yeah, like there's a story of technical and psychic individuation kind of co-defining each other, in a way that's at the end of the day is probably consistent with what he's saying here. I'm interested to keep going.
Yeah, I think that maybe that's a good point to keep going and look at what he says about human memory. So if someone else would like to read the next paragraph.
I can go.
Sure, go ahead.
In human memory, on the contrary, it is the form that is preserved. Preservation itself is only a limited aspect of memory, which is the power of selecting forms, of schematizing experience. The machine would be capable of performing a similar function only if the already recorded magnetic tape was superior to a new tape in recording certain sound figures, which is not the case. The plasticity in the memory of machines is that of the medium, whereas in human memory it is the plasticity of the content itself. One can say that in man, the function of preserving recollections resides in memory, because memory, conceived as a set, ensemble of forms, of schemas, receives the recollection it records because memory connects the recollection with its forms. In a machine, on the contrary, recording occurs without prior memory. From this essential difference comes human memory's significant incapacity for fixing elements without order. It would take a very long time to learn the relative positions of 50 tokens of different colors and shapes emptied on a table in disorder. Even a blurred photographic view is more useful than a human witness when it comes to affirming the relative position of various objects in space. Machine memory triumphs in multiplicity and disorder. Human memory triumphs in the unity of forms and in order. Every time a function of integration or comparison appears, the most complex and best-built machine provides results that are considerably inferior to those that human memory can achieve. A calculating machine can be coded in order to translate, but its translation remains very elementary and crude. It presupposes a prior reduction of each of the two languages on a simplified basis, along with a reduced vocabulary and a fixed number of turns of phrase. For the machine lacks the plasticity of integration, which is the vital aspect of memory through which it distinguishes itself in that very instant from machine memory. The storage, here we have the footnote, English in original, the storage of the calculator or the translating machine, which is nothing but a classical calculating machine coded in a certain way, is very different from the function of the present through which memory exists in man at the very level of perception, through perception, making sense of the present word according to the general turn of phrase and of earlier phrases, or even according to the totality of experience acquired in the past regarding the person who speaks. Human memory receives contents that have a formative power in the sense that they overlap with themselves, are grouped as if acquired experience served as a code for new acquisitions, in order to interpret and fix them. In man, and more generally in the living being, content becomes coding, whereas in the machine, coding and content remain separate as condition and conditioned. Content introduced into human memory will superimpose itself on prior content and take form on it. The living is that in which the a posteriori becomes a priori. Memory is the function by which a posteriori becomes a posteriori matters become a priori.
All right, so here's the other side of the comparison is so human memory, and the two sort of the main characteristics that he points out that distinguish human memory from machine memory are, first, that it processes the input. It selects structures and forms in the input rather than just passively capturing what it receives. And so this means that so the weakness of this is that it's hard to remember unstructured information, like a random assortment of objects on a desk or something. But the strength is that it is able to capture whatever patterns or structure there is in the input in a much more sophisticated way than just sort of passive machine recording. And then the second characteristic that he emphasizes here is that memory builds on previous memory. So whereas a tape is just sort of each recording on a tape is sort of independent of the previous ones, and actually a brand new tape is better as a recording mechanism than one that has been used before, because there's still traces of previous recordings on it, even if you try to erase it. But in the case of human memory, the processing and the process of grasping those forms and structures in the input and remembering them is built on previous memories. So one example that I was thinking of as we were reading this is chess masters have a much better memory of positions on a chessboard than sort of novice players, but it's actually been studied in laboratory settings that if you position chess pieces in just random positions, like not positions that can occur in a game, but just distribute pieces randomly on the board, the chess masters have no better performance than a novice. So what the chess masters are remembering when they remember positions on the board is not just the sort of raw position of the pieces on a geometric surface. It's the structure of the positions as an instance of a game situation. So their memory is built on their knowledge of chess and their memory of previous games and the knowledge of strategies and so on. Rather than just being a passive absorption of the geometric layout of the pieces on a board.
That's great. There's something of the crystal in that, like we were talking, like in some of the first stuff that we read, where that sounds like more ontogenetic memory that is relational and associational to the person's lived experience in their individuation or whatever, as opposed to a kind of more like an engineering perspective on what perception is or something like that in terms of absolute positionality.
Yeah, so it's a type of perception and memory that grasps relations between elements in the picture. So the structure is built up of those relations, and so his sort of theory of knowledge involves the idea that grasping these structures, grasping relationships means sort of creating those same relationships within your own knowledge. So knowledge of transductive processes means undergoing transduction in your own knowledge. The knowledge itself is structured in the same way as that which it knows, and so it's much more active and structured, rather than just a sort of passive and structureless recording, like in the case of the magnetic tape.
That's great. That's very well put.
I see Simondo repurposing Gestalt psychology a bit in this and previous two paragraphs.
Yeah, I see that too, to a degree, although I'm mindful of the fact that, and we were in the Heidegger reading last week in the basic writings group, we were talking about Gestalt theory as it relates to Heidegger's Dasein. And the caution there was not to be too ocular centric about things, such that, so that like a Gestalt is it's a very perceptual or ocular centric sort of metaphor. Whereas, somebody like Heidegger and probably someone like Simondon would be more invested in the kind of like, a deeper sort of more ontological account of what's going on. But that said, I totally see what you're saying.
Yeah, I see your point. And the fact that he also mentioned tape recording oral forms also goes to show that it's not about vision we are talking about here. Form is more general than seeing.
Yeah, that's exactly how I would put it. Yeah, for sure. Form is deeper than just seeing.
Yeah, Simondon does draw on Gestalt psychology a lot, it's good to point out the sort of prevalence of visual examples in a lot of discussion of Gestalt psychology. But it's also the case that some of the early studies in Gestalt psychology, one of the sort of early examples that was introduced to motivate the idea of the gestalt or the form in perception was the idea of a melody. So the fact that a melody sort of preserves its unity, whether you can raise it up an octave or down an octave, it's still recognizable as the same melody. Whereas if you take one note and raise it a semitone or a tone, then it changes the whole structure of the melody. That is not the same melody anymore. So the form, the melody itself is a form that is recognizable through differences in the pitch of the melody as a whole, but that can be transformed by changing one note in the melody. So that's an instance of this gestalt or form at work in the auditory mode.
I think, and Husserl does the same thing, right? When he talks about memory in his work, he talks about primary and secondary retention, and he uses the melody as a kind of as his working example more than once.
Yeah, that's right. And Husserl also was drawing on Gestalt psychology. It was sort of the I guess cutting edge school of early 20th century psychology, and the criticism of atomistic theories of knowledge. So the idea that knowledge would be built up by sort of individual atoms or point ideas, like you'd have a sensation of red and in this point of your visual field, and then another sensation of red in this other point of your visual field, and then those would be associated together, and then you'd eventually build up the image of an apple or whatever it is. And then Gestalt psychology sort of introduced the idea or motivated the idea that there was much more structure in perception rather than being built up from these sort of structureless atoms. And so things like shapes and background and foreground and things like that were inherent structures in perception that these sort of color points and things like that were fitted into rather than being built up out of the atoms. So we can go on, I think, to the next paragraph, if someone would like to read.
Sure, I can go. A complex technical operation, however, requires the use of both forms of memory. A complex technical operation, however, requires the use of both forms of memory. Non-living memory, the memory of the machine, is useful in cases where faithfulness in the preservation of details outweighs the syncretic nature of a recollection integrated into experience, having signification through its relation with other elements. Machine memory is the memory of the document, of the result of measurement. Man's memory is that which, after an interval of many years, evokes a situation because it involves the same significations, the same feelings, the same dangers as another, or simply because the similarity makes sense according to the implicit vital coding constituted by experience. In both cases, memory allows self-regulation, but human memory enables a self-regulation according to an ensemble of significations valid in the living and capable of developing only in the latter. That of the machine grounds a self-regulation that makes sense in the world of non-living beings. The significations according to which human memory functions stop were those according to which memory functions begin. The coupling of man to machine begins to exist from the very moment when a coding common to both of these memories can be discovered, in order for a partial convertibility of one into the other to be realized, so that a synergy can become possible. One case of this coupling is provided by the permanent data file of telephone calls. The summarized information recording up-to-date results recently obtained from multiple domains classed under different rubrics is recorded on magnetic tapes. A catalog and a telephone call system make it possible, through the use of selectors, to rapidly obtain a readout of what has been recorded on any of the magnetic tapes. Here, human memory is where the words and names of the rubrics have signification. The machine, on the contrary, is where a series of definite pulses provokes one magnetic tape player to be powered and not another. This fixed and rigid faculty for selection is very different from the one that prompts the inquirer to dial one particular telephone number rather than another. This pure case of coupling between machine and man helps to understand the mode of coupling that exists in other cases. There is coupling when a single and complete function is carried out by both beings. Such a possibility exists every time that a technical function has a defined self-regulation. Functions that contain a self-regulation are the ones where the accomplishment of a task is directed not only by a model to be copied according to an end, but by a partial result of the accomplishment of the task intervening as a condition. In the artisanal operation, this control through information gathering is frequent. Man being at once the mover, moteur, tool, and the perceiving subject regulates his action according to instantaneous partial results. The tool is at once tool and instrument, which is to say a means of action prolonging the organs and a channel of recurring information. The machine, on the contrary, as a complete closed individual replacing man, generally has no system of self-regulation. It goes through the motions of a stereotypy of successive gestures according to a predetermined conditioning. This first type of machine is what one would call a mechanical being without self-regulation. It is indeed a practical technical unit, but not a technical individual, strictly speaking.
So in this paragraph, it's not entirely clear to me what this system he's describing does, the telephone catalog system. So it's recording some information regarding a telephone call, and then it allows you to retrieve that information off of a magnetic tape, but I'm not sure exactly what it's doing. I don't know if anyone else understood that better than me.
Is it maybe like the equivalent of 1-900 numbers? I don't mean those kind, but like where you call and just receive information about the weather or whatever, or a pre-recorded song or something like that, right? That like that telephony was an information service as well as a person-to-person communications network at different points in history.
Yeah, that's possible. I didn't think of that. So it's something like, press 1 for X, press 2 for Y, etc. And there'd be, a set of pre-recorded messages that you could select from. It could be that. I'm not sure.
Or maybe not even a phone tree per se, but more like just a one number devoted to one thing, basically, right? Where if you want to call and hear a song or call and hear a speech or something, then you'd call a number. I know that historically telephonic systems had moments like that where they were more public information relay systems rather than point to point for people.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought that up also, because there was a system, I'm not sure exactly when it developed, but it peaked, I think, in the 80s in France, called Minitel, which used telephone lines for transmitting information. And it was sort of like a precursor of internet systems, where you could have like there was like sort of online shopping or like over the phone shopping, and games and stuff like that over this Minitel system that used phone lines. But then it sort of disappeared after the 80s. So I'm not sure if it existed at this time when he's writing. I don't think so, but I'm not 100% certain about the chronology there. But in terms of the sort of conceptual level in this paragraph, so he's pointing out that these this, I guess, more simple form of coupling between the human and the machine, it relies on the human for the regulation of the pair. So the machine itself doesn't have a self-regulating system. It doesn't have a feedback mechanism that can sort of perceive the results and then correct the action to make sure it matches the desired result. It relies on the human to use the machine as both something as like an effector to carry out actions, and then also as an instrument to retrieve information from regarding the action. And so the human regulation is what is carrying out the self-regulation of the whole system.
I think that this is probably the most succinct and specific part of a kind of critique of artificial intelligence, or even inherently signifying data, both of which seem to be the common these days, both of which seem to be relatively common, at least in the kind of discourse related to technology in the last several decades. The kind of inherent significating properties of data, and then the inherent kind of cognitive function of machinic processes. I think these are probably the two points in which this paragraph functions more succinctly than anything so far to kind of point out the kind of like rigid distinction, I guess, in which he's making, which would kind of preclude these types of things from being possible, and subjecting them to the realm of abstraction rather than of individuation, or of technical objects individuated, I guess.
Yeah, that it gives you a really great sort of vocabulary to understand AI in the context, like as historically continuous with recording technologies, right? So that you don't have to have this conversation about how AI is a mind or something like that, or that AI will replace human beings, when you can frame it as being just another, another with extra layers of complexification or something like that, that it is a kind of, it's a recording technology, a kind of collective recording technology.
Yeah, right. And this kind of displaces the loci of the action to the subject, which has human memory, rather than the proposed non-human subjectivity of the machine come to life, which I always call the Frankenstein concept. So yeah, no, this would, you could think about this in terms of like levels of abstraction, like each like sense in which we have like a external cognitive mechanical object would just be kind of a functional level of abstraction in our own cognitive apparatus, or our own thinking, which has, as he notes, like a very different type of memory function than computing technology does, which is mostly still the case, I believe. I don't think. I mean, I guess somebody could make the argument contrary to that, I guess, with all the research into like neural nets and computational theory of mind, because you could read a computational theory of mind, at least a wide one, to be contrary to Simondon's claim in this paragraph as well. But I think there is just kind of a minimal sense in which there's an overlap, in which it is still a fundamental categorical rootedness in the human, or the life, the freedom in which like the life form makes independent choices of the machinic processes, I suppose.
Yeah, that what you're saying is totally consistent with. It's also worth mentioning, I think, is Bernard Stiegler's work. Like just reading these last couple of sections, this seems to me like it's precisely the place where Bernard Stiegler's work takes off in terms of tertiary memory, like that what it means to remember things in the first place will always be invested or involved in some kind of technical substrate, whether it's chiseling glyphs onto rock, or whether it's the latest AI, basically, right? That there's a kind of sense in which we are exteriorizing memory into our technology, and the logic of that technology will thereby dictate how we'll individuate.
Yeah, I don't know Stiegler's work very well. I hardly at all, actually. But I do know that he did draw on Simondon quite a bit, and he actually just died recently. Yeah, so that's an interesting point to bring up.
Notable bank robber philosopher.
Yeah, probably the only sort of famous philosopher who has robbed them. Okay, so we can go on to the next paragraph, and I will read. Despite appearances, it is, on the contrary, the truly automatic machine that least replaces man, because the function of regulation that exists in this machine presupposes a variability in its operation, an adaptability of its functioning to the completion of this work. A rather elementary enthusiasm for self-regulating automata lets us forget that these machines are precisely the ones that are most reliant on man, while the other machines need man simply as a servant or organizer, Self-regulating machines need man as a technician, which is to say as an associate. Their relation to man is situated at the level of this regulation, not at the level of elements or ensembles. But it is through this regulation that automatic machines can be linked to the technical ensemble in which they function. Just as the human individual is not linked to the group by his elementary functions, whether active or perceptive, but by his self-regulation, which gives him his personality and character. So the machine is integrated with the ensemble, not only in an abstract and preliminary way by its function, but also at every moment by the way it performs its own task according to the requirements of the ensemble. There is no such thing as a purely internal, entirely isolated self-regulation. The results of the action are not merely results in themselves, but also in relation to their external milieu, to the ensemble. Now, this aspect of self-regulation in which the whole of the milieu must be taken into account cannot be achieved by the machine alone, even if it is perfectly automated. The type of memory and the type of perception needed for this aspect of regulation call for the integration and transformation of the a posteriori into the a priori, which only the living thing can achieve within itself. There is something alive in a technical ensemble, and the integrative function of life can be ensured only by human beings. The human being has the capacity to understand the functioning of the machine. On the one hand, and the capacity to live on the other. One can speak of technical life as being that which actualizes this relation between these two functions in man. Man is capable of taking upon himself the relation between the living being that he is and the machine he fabricates. The technical operation requires both technical and natural life.
Do you think that's supposed to be man is capable of taking upon himself, and it's just an error in editing?
Yeah, sorry, I noticed that. I just corrected it in reading. I think it is supposed to say taking.
Okay, that's what I was assuming that. I think I ran across that once or twice too in this. No, this definitely kind of confirmed my suspicion, but it's interesting because in a broader sense that this dependence on the human subject for the technical ensemble's lifelike function, I guess, or integrate. It says there's something alive in it. So are we? Well, this is an aside possibly, but I mean, could we say that Simondon's claims technical ensembles are alive now because he says this? Can we say this, or do we have to kind of put that with an asterisk and say, oh, they're part of our integrative function of life that relies on a human being to make sense of that? I mean, is there a way in which we can just say, like, yes, this technical ensemble is alive because of like the general like milieu, or the totality of the milieu or something like that, and be like, well, this milieu is total, so this technical object is alive, and then you can just kind of anticipate a human subject or something like that. I don't know. I'm trying to like be as critical as I can to the reading of this paragraph, I guess.
Yeah, I think I mean, as I would read it, I think he wouldn't say that the technical ensemble as a whole is alive, but that the human being as a living being sort of carries out the integrative function of the ensemble. So I think he would reserve the property of life to the human being as a living being.
Yeah, that would be the coherent reading, probably. I just wanted to make it a potentially contradictory. But yeah, no, that's probably the only charitable way to read what he's saying here. But there is I joined a little late today, but I noticed that he mentioned the a posteriori and the a priori in a prior paragraph in relation to the memory, and it looks like he's going on in that vein. Did you all discuss this distinction at all?
No, not yet. I mean, if you think about it, cybernetic machines are kind of like that, right? Like they have to take a principle of a realizable telos or a realizable goal as already having been accomplished, and then work backwards in order to project the steps to achieve that goal. That's kind of like a basic principle in cybernetics. So there's that, and then I guess again going back to a more media theoretic sort of situation, like you would find in somebody like Stiegler that our current information systems and their emphasis on on formal semantics or something like that necessarily organizes us into a knowledge-based, fact-based sort of formal technical environment in which we operate, right? And that sort of is what's driving big data as a kind of new a posteriori, which we will all come to inhabit.
I'm worried that this externalization of this integration function might reduce it to the same type of mechanism and therefore exclude it from that same integrative function. Like if we use this integrative function of life to kind of bestow this life-likeness on a technical ensemble and ostensibly guarantee it in some respects, it seems like what an immediate worry would be the kind of disintegration of this back into this uncontrolled form. I'm kind of worried about the way that this is kind of describing how we kind of bestow a power of lifelikeness in this integrative function, but whether the whole of the milieu is taken into account, I think, is not entirely evident by people's interactions with, I guess, incomplete interactions with these technical objects.
Or interactions that presume either one side or the other of the divide, the dichotomy that he's described elsewhere, between whether that right now, as it stands, that maybe our current circumstances, or as you're describing it, the risk is that we will just continually define ourselves as either being a technical element, in which case we will be enacted upon by our technologies, or we will see things from the view of the ensemble in terms of the more managerial and planning positions that a technocratic society sort of organizes for us, and that we aren't sort of achieving the sort of range of the technical individual, maybe is another way of saying what you're saying. I don't know.
This is foreshadowing a little bit what we're going to talk about in a couple of pages, which about the technocratic stuff. So I mean, I don't know. I love philosophy of technology because you can cover almost any other interesting topic.
I would also say that the sort of concern that you were just elaborating there was very much on Simodo's, not Simodo, on Stiegler's mind. Like you were sort of saying that it's a kind of disintegration. He calls it disindividuation. That the age that we're currently living in now is an age of disindividuation, where our technical systems have overrun us, and we don't, because of the sort of the way that we've organized our individuation in relation to systems. It's now causing our sort of global disindividuation, is the way he puts it.
Okay, yeah, no, that's fascinating because that is kind of what I was worrying about, because it's fundamentally has to be rooted in the way that this function of life, integrative function of life, ensures the kind of milieu of the technical object that I think must be, if there are problems that result from this kind of disintegration, that must be in somehow the result of this, because this is the entire operational context. So it's like I can only look to the way that we bestow this integrative wholeness to the milieu of the technical object as part of the problem that was causally related to the disintegrative issues, where we see the kind of terrible mythos of like data as data, and you're just wondering, well, what is this? And you're like, well, it's data. It's like the purely quantitative, like, overtaking of the qualitative, I guess, is what I would describe that kind of terror as related to.
Which is basically which is kind of like an epistemic reconfiguration of capital, basically, would be another way of thinking about it, right? Of exchange relations as capitalism establishes them or maintains them.
Right. The exchange function would be, definitely the apex of that, and that would be in that territory, which I'm never good at describing. So
yeah, I think it's interesting in this paragraph. He's introducing a theme. I don't think he's mentioned it earlier, or maybe in passing, but it's an important theme for him. the idea of criticizing the idea that automation is sort of inherently a good thing or inherently equivalent to technical progress. The idea that improving technical development means increasing automation, and I think, and of course, was like a prevalent idea at the time he's writing this in the 50s, and then into the 60s as well. The idea of like a fully automated factory where you would not need any workers, and you just input the production, the specifications, and then the factory would just produce it on its own. This was sort of like a dream for management at the time. But in modern context, you can look at similar types of ideology around algorithms. I think would be sort of the modern equivalent. And so I'm just thinking of there's a big controversy going on now in the UK about the exam seed versus the entrance exams, where because students weren't able to actually do the exams this year because of COVID-19. Instead, they used some algorithm that was supposed to predict what your results would be, but it's anyway has had some terrible results where people who if you're a good student at a bad school, it predicts that you're going to do badly and things like that. And so there's this general ideology of replacing human decision making with algorithms as if that's something sort of inherently more rational or more less subjective or something like that. And then it sort of obscures the fact that human the human integrative capacity, the human being is still involved in setting up the system and designing it and making the connections between different elements and so on. So highlighting the coupling between the algorithm and the human operator, the way that Simondon does for automatic machines, I think would sort of bring to the foreground the decision making involved in establishing algorithmic systems.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that the mystique of the algorithm is exactly the type of thing that is what I'm worried about in this context, and I think that these types of remarks pinpoint most succinctly, because the algorithm is precisely this subversion of the integrative function of life in some regards. I mean, if algorithms just work kind of in the background and we just have results, they could just seem magical anyway, and it wouldn't really make a difference. But insofar as we consider them as algorithms and grant them that kind of conceptual independence as a mode of action, I think we kind of displace the responsibility of human action. And that's an extremely terrifying thought to me. So anyway.
Yeah, so I think the ideology of automation of the 50s and 60s that he's writing about, I think has sort of survived in this transformed way in the ideology of algorithms today. So I think that's something we can sort of keep in mind as we're reading this, like to what extent what he's saying about automation and the way it relates to human beings applies to algorithms today. I think that's an interesting sort of point of comparison.
I'm gonna go ahead and read. Y'all can hear me, right?
Yep.
Okay. Technical life, however, does not consist in overseeing machines, but in existing at the same level as a being that takes charge of the relation between them, capable of being coupled simultaneously or successively with several machines. Each machine can be compared to a monad isolated in itself. The capacities of the machines are only those that have been put in it by its constructor. It unfolds its properties just as substance develops its attributes. The machine results from its essence. Man, on the contrary, is not a monad, for in him the a posteriori becomes a priori, the event becomes a principle. Man as technician does not perform this function prior to the manufacture of machines, but during their operation. He fulfills the function of the present and maintains the correlation because his life consists of the rhythm of the machines that surround him and that he connects to one another. He fulfills the function of integration and prolongs self-regulation beyond each monad of automatism through the interconnection and intercommutation of monads. The technician is indeed in a certain sense the man of ensembles, but in a very different way from the one that characterizes the industrialist. The industrialist, in the same way as the worker, is pushed by finality. He targets a result. Herein lies their alienation. The technician is the man of the operation in the course of its accomplishment. He does not take charge of directing the ensemble, but rather guides its self-regulation during functioning. He absorbs within himself the sense of the work and the sense of the industrial direction. He is the man who knows the internal schemas of functioning and organizes them in relation to each other. On the contrary, machines are ignorant of general solutions and cannot resolve general problems. Whenever it is possible to replace a complex operation by a greater number of simple operations, this procedure is used in the machine. This is the case for calculating machines that use a binary system of numeration rather than a decimal system, and reduce all operations to a series of additions. I have to maintain a certain skepticism about this paragraph, because I think binary systems of numeration have shown to be computationally as sufficient as decimal systems in linear programming contexts, I guess. I don't know what y'all's thoughts on this are, but this is the first time I've really been broadly skeptical of a paragraph, in particularly this relation of binary to decimal systems.
Yeah, I don't think he's arguing for any sort of superiority of the decimal system to the binary system. I think he's pointing to the use of binary arithmetic in computer systems rather than decimal as sort of an instance of the way that mechanical procedures break down a problem into simple operations. So, like in the previous paragraph, he talked about using a calculating machine or a simple computer to translate from one language to another. But then he points out that in order to do this, you have to sort of you have to reduce the two languages to a sort of rigid structure. So you can translate sort of one word to another, and fit them into this rigid structure. But if you just have sort of free natural language input, it becomes much harder to translate from one to the other. So that's another instance of taking a problem and breaking it down into a simple set of operations, a set of simple operations. And I think that's what he's pointing to here, rather than saying that that decimal arithmetic is in some way superior to binary arithmetic.
Well, yeah, no, I think that there's a few things then that I would be skeptical of, and I was already kind of skeptical of that claim originally as he was making it, and then grew more so as he related it to the differences in the decimal and binary system. But I think more at the crux of my criticism, though, would be the notion that there could not be a purely mechanical optimization function, because it seems to me to be shown to be the case. This seemed to be like a very kind of obvious fact of computing, like as it's practiced now. Like, we just kind of know that we can, in a way that requires no human intervention, that is like a strictly mechanical way, fulfill these kind of technical problems. So in a sense, like, the specificity and generality question is where I'm in the most disagreement with, and everything kind of follows from that. I definitely don't think that the key to this is exemplified at all in the difference between the binary system and the decimal system. For instance, you could say, well, there has to be some kind of human that has created it originally, but that claim kind of becomes stale in a sense if there's I don't know. I no longer really like think that that distinction is as poignant, I suppose, if we can't really talk about the way that these types of general techniques can be accomplished in a way that's still either mechanical or um, technical in its milieu. I want to maintain that distinction even with systems that can be shown to be generally optimization capable. For instance, the example with natural languages, I would like to for there to be able to be shown to be a model for which, in a purely mechanical way, we can account for without any kind of pre-existing kind of model for language, what language people were speaking, if they were trying to communicate an idea, so to speak. Like, well, take some utterances or even some kind of auditory signal and reduce that into what predictive results for what things could be communicated. Like, I think that this should be like theoretically possible, although like difficult, right? But it's just because I don't think that this has been like excluded, at least, like this model of just kind of predictive natural language processing, where you could just take any like glossolalia that you just kind of say random syllables and have a model that predicts what this could mean, independent of any kind of basis in language, but just based on signal processing, right? Just information theoretically. I don't know. Maybe I'm being too tangential here, but I just worry that the way that he describes this is at risk of kind of not being able to describe very well the distinction that optimized functionality could still be either mechanical or technical.
So if I understand what you're saying that any issue of optimization does not, it's not just something that just rebounds onto human beings, that with somehow divorced from technicity, but you're sort of saying that there's a kind of like, you sort of, in dealing with some problem, in dealing with sort of simplifying some operation, you fall into other theories of optimization.
No, well, I'm more thinking that there's just this like one sense of optimization in functional logic optimization, sort of, and that this relates to the kind of generalization or the organization that I think that he's talking about as being implicitly imbued upon the technical object by and its milieu by the human life and the human. And I just think that this is at risk of kind of undervaluing the human contribution to the milieu of technical objects if we reduce this to purely this action of management, and we just kind of think of ourselves as like part of this mechanical model where this necessary piece to the syllogism of the mechanical object. Like, well, these things were just all like disorganized, and then we kind of came in here and like organized them all. It's like technological imperialism or something like that. I don't know.
It's a really interesting perspective. Yeah, I mean, I confess I don't fully fully grasp it, but I appreciate the distinction that you're bringing into the conversation for sure.
Well, okay, think about okay, like in the sense of the way that we think of like the computing technology that we're very familiar with. We think of it as playing these organizational roles and seemingly generalized roles, where one thing can be used for so many different things that it doesn't seem to kind of omit the orientation and say like, well, these things are only oriented the way they are because we're there doing the orientation of them. It seems like the role we play is bigger than just merely the orientation of these objects, and because we play an actual like kind of ontological role in the individuation of the technical object, we should not reduce it to this purely like mechanical kind of bestowing. I don't know. Maybe this is all resolved, and I'm just having misgivings on a temporary level. So I'm not sure what to say. I probably shouldn't go on too much about this.
No, it's fine. I'll take your misgivings as cues for sure as we go along.
Yeah, I think raising critical comments or pointed questions and so on is a useful exercise. We don't have to take everything that Simondo says as gospel or anything like that. We can criticize what he says and use that as a guide as we're continuing to read to see if maybe he does answer these questions, or if there's a gap that he doesn't address. We can sort of keep that in mind.
Yeah, definitely. And tell me if I'm being too long-winded too.
No, that's fine. I mean, the point of the group is to discuss it. I mean, we could each read the text on our own, without without the discussion. So the discussion is what the sort of value added of this group is. So we can go on to the next paragraph if someone would like to read. Well, if there's no volunteers, then I guess I'll read. In this sense, one can affirm that the birth of a technical philosophy at the level of ensembles is possible only through an in-depth study of regulations, which is to say of information. True technical ensembles are not the ones that use technical individuals, but those that form a fabric of technical individuals through a relation of interconnection. Any philosophy of techniques that starts from the reality of ensembles using technical individuals without putting them into a relation of information remains a philosophy of human power through techniques, not a philosophy of techniques. One could use the term autocratic philosophy of techniques for a philosophy that takes the technical ensemble as a place where machines are used in order to obtain power, puissance. The machine is only a means. The end is the conquest of nature, the domestication of natural forces by means of a first act of enslavement. The machine is a slave whose purpose is to make other slaves. Such a dominating and enslaving inspiration can coincide with the quest for man's freedom, but it is difficult to free oneself by transferring slavery onto other beings, men, animals, or machines. To reign over a people of machines that enslave the entire world is still to reign, and every reign presupposes the acceptance of the schemas of enslavement. So he's introducing here this contrast between this autocratic philosophy of techniques that is based on the idea of human reign over machines, or human reign of over nature through machines, and he's going to introduce or contrast this with I guess a more liberatory philosophy of techniques, so that involves a relationship with machines rather than a rule over machines. So we can go on to the next paragraph. For any volunteers?
I can go. Technocratic philosophy itself is affected by an enslaving violence, insofar as it is technocratic. A technicism that comes from a reflection on automatic technical ensembles is inspired by the unbridled will to conquer. It is immoderate and lacks internal control and self-mastery. It is a force that is unleashed and which can only perpetuate itself for the duration of the ascending phase of success or conquest. Saint Simonism triumphed under the Second Empire because there were train platforms to be built, railway track to be laid, bridges and viaducts to be spread across the valleys, and tunnels to be pierced through mountains. This aggressive conquest has the characteristics of a rape of nature. Man enters into possession of the earth's bowels, traverses and labors, trespasses onto what had previously been unreachable. Thus, technocracy, in a certain sense, implies a violation of the sacred. To throw a bridge over an inland sea, to attach an island to the continent, to pierce an isthmus, is to modify the configuration of the earth, to undermine its natural integrity. There is a pride of domination in this violence, and man entitles himself as creator, or at least foreman of creation. He plays the role of the demiurge. It is Faust's dream being played out by an entire society, by all technicians. Indeed, the development of technics is not enough for technocratism to emerge. Technocratism represents a will to acquire power that comes to light in a group of men possessing knowledge, but not power. The knowledge of technics, but not the money to put them to work, or the legislative power to free themselves of all constraint. In France, technocrats are essentially polytechnicians, which is to say men who, with respect to technics, find themselves in a situation of being intelligent users and organizers of techniques rather than veritable technicians. These mathematicians think in sets, ensembles, not in individual operational units. What holds their attention is not so much the machine as enterprise.
Yeah, so this is further development on this autocratic philosophy of technics, so he's identifying it with the technocracy, so Saint-Simon or Saint-Simonism was it was sort of like a early socialism, but it was understood in a sort of a top-down manner. So it wasn't a workers' movement, but socialism as a sort of rationalized organization of society. So society would be run by like engineers or people with scientific knowledge of the workings of society, and this same idea has sort of reemerged at different times. I mean, there was a technocracy movement in the United States in the 1930s, I think, like associated with the New Deal, the idea that you would have sort of a rationally planned society through having like scientific technicians running things, and I guess maybe today you could look at sort of like Silicon Valley ideology, the idea that like I don't know, Elon Musk or something should be in charge of everything.
The ethical overtones, I found them striking in this passage. I think especially around the words self-mastery, as if there's a certain level of requisite self-mastery that is needed to entertain a proper relation to technical individuation. This also reminds me of perhaps kindred spirit in philosophy, Alfred North Whitehead. He also, I think, in this similarly vast speculative construction, sometimes took these swipes at professionals, professional ethics, if not directly engineers. Or I think Isabel Stengers had a good discussion of this aspect in Whitehead, in her book on Whitehead, of course.
Right. Yeah. There's always a pretty strong ethical element in Simondon that's sometimes in the background and sometimes more foregrounded. And so a text that we read, I guess a couple months ago now, on the technical mentality, that it specifically talked about developing a normative, developing norms from technology, and relation to different modes of technology, and yeah, so he's definitely I guess proposing an ethics of human relation to technical reality that would not that rather than dominating nature through techniques would involve a self-mastery and a sort of self-regulation in that and then a sort of a relation of almost equality between humans and technical reality, not of domination. Right, and Lathe Mason has posted in the chat here a link to a contemporary proponent of technocracy. So it's technocracyinc.org. We can check that out after. But yeah, so this idea, sort of resurfaces in new forms every 20 years or so. But yeah, just the general idea that the people who have a knowledge of technology should be in charge of society, basically. Okay, we can go on to the next paragraph.
Okay. Furthermore, let me drink some water. 1 second. I'm sorry.
Everyone should stay hydrated.
Yes, stay hydrated, everyone.
This is step work.
Yes. Furthermore, and essentially, In an even more profound way, the conditioning arising from the state of technics comes to be added onto that of psychosocial conditioning. The 19th century could produce only a technological, technocratic philosophy because it discovered engines and not regulations. It is the age of thermodynamics. However, in a certain sense, an engine is indeed a technical individual, since it cannot function without a certain number of regulations, or at least the very least, a certain number of automatisms, intake, exhaust. But these automatisms are auxiliary. Their function is to enable the renewal of the cycle. Sometimes the addition to stationary machines of veritable self-regulators, such as Watt's governor, a centrifugal regulator called a ball regulator, individualizes the heat engine in a very complete way. Regulators nevertheless remain accessories. When a thermal machine has to generate great momentum in accordance with an extremely intermittent working condition regime, it is good to have a man keeping watch nearby who can press the regulator lever before the load increases, because the regulator, by intervening with too much of a delay, risks intervening when the engine has already slowed down because of the sudden load increase. This is what happens when a steam engine is used to cut large tree trunks into planks. Once the regulator kicks in without human intervention, the circular saw has already stalled or the belt has already fallen. The operator hits the regulator lever a half second before the saw wheel cuts into the trunk. The engine thus functions at full speed and is accelerating when the workload suddenly increases. On the other hand, the Watt regulator is extremely efficient and precise when load variations become slower and gradual. Such incapacity for rapid variations can be explained by the fact that in the thermodynamic engines, even when there is self-regulation, it has no information channels that are separate from the effectors. There is effectively a feedback information channel in the Watt governor, a channel of counter-reaction, feedback, but this information is transmitted through a channel that is not distinct from the one used by the motive power that allows the engine to move a resistant organ. The regulator is connected to the output shaft, the whole ensemble made up of the flywheels, the main shaft, the volumetric cylinder device, and then the system for transforming alternating movement into circular movement must therefore already have slowed down through the loss of its kinetic energy, so that the regulator can intervene by increasing the emission time of the engine and consequently also its power. Now, there is a serious drawback in this lack of distinction between the motive power channel, the energy channel, and the feedback channel, the information channel, which greatly reduces the effectiveness of regulation and the extent of the individualization of the technical being. When the engine slows down, which is necessary in order for the regulator to come into action, the decrease in running speed causes a decrease in power, the engine power in low or medium working conditions regime, where the throttling of steam in the sliding valve does not come into play, is proportional to the sum of all the elementary work performed by successive piston strokes in a unit of time. The decrease in angular speed results in the deterioration, can't say words, of the very conditions of reactivity that the regulator is designed to provoke. I probably might as well sum up with a small additional paragraph. It is this lack of distinction between the energy channel and the information channel that marks the thermodynamic age and constitutes the limit of the individualization of thermal engines. Suppose, on the contrary, that a gauge measures the torque on the transmission shaft at the outlet of a heat engine at every moment, and that the result of this measurement is sent back to a steam intake or fuel intake or carburized air intake if it is an internal combustion engine, so as to increase steam intake in relation to the increased resistance exerted on the transmission shaft. The pathway by which the resistance measurement then is fed back into the steam supply and modifies it is thus distinct from the energy channel. Steam cylinder, piston rod, crankshaft, axle, transmission shaft. There's no need for the engine to slow down for its power to increase. The information sampling rate along the information channel can be extremely high with respect to the time constants of the energy channel. For instance, one every few hundredths or a few thousandths of a second, while the cycle of a stationary steam engine lasts about a quarter of a second.
Right. So here in these two paragraphs, he's relating this technocratic ideology to a specific era of technics, so the thermodynamic era, and specifically, it's the relation. It's the fact that thermal machines don't have a distinct energy and information channel. So, to the extent that there is feedback and self-regulation in these machines, it has to operate through the energy channel, and that's a limit to the individuation of the machines. So he gives sort of a detailed breakdown, I guess, of the functioning of the Watt governor, but it's a little bit hard to follow if you don't already know how it works, I think. Lath Mason posted the image of the Watt governor in the chat there. And the basic idea is that you have these two, like you have a weight or a ball that is attached to this flywheel, and the flywheel is attached to the intake of the steam engine. And so the faster the engine is running, the higher the weights will rise, and that will open up the intake and allow more steam through into the mechanism. Sorry, I don't know the precise vocabulary, but basically the operation of the engine itself regulates the power of the engine. So if the engine slows down, then it opens up and feeds more power to make it speed up again. And then if the engine speeds up, it closes down and feeds less power into the engine. So the limitation of this has to do with the fact that there's no separate information channel, and so it can only operate at the speed of the cycle of the engine. So a quarter of a second, as he points out here, it's a fairly slow reaction time. So it's only once the engine starts to slow down already that you can start feeding more power into it. Whereas if you have a separate information channel, you can anticipate the slowdown. So you can have the resistance measured before the engine starts to slow down and increase power before the slowdown happens. And that's basically the function that the human is performing in the example of the saw that he points to. So the human, rather than waiting for the saw to engage the trunk and the engine to slow down, the human will increase the power half a second before the saw hits the trunk, so that the saw is already operating at full speed when it hits the trunk, rather than waiting for it to slow down.
It may have been brought up previously, but the thermodynamic age, is that situated in terms of like the previously delineated eras of the encyclopedic spirit? Or is it part of the technological age in the last of the three, or previous to that, or where does it fit in? Is it another stage, supposedly?
I think this is a different periodization than that one, the three stages of Encyclopedism. So yeah, the three stages of Encyclopedism were the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and then the sort of modern or contemporary era, the sort of ongoing stage introduced by cybernetics that he was witnessing at his time. So I think the thermodynamic age that he's pointing to here fits into a different periodization. But he did at one point contrast the thermodynamic the age of thermodynamic machines with the age of electrical machines. I can't remember exactly where that was, but yeah, so the thermodynamic age would be roughly the 19th century, and then starting around like the 1890s or so, you have the introduction of electricity into industrial manufacturing, and the way that it requires industry to be integrated into an electrical network, as opposed to the way thermal factories were sort of self-contained systems.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's very clarifying, actually.
So he's pointed out this connection between technocratic philosophy and the thermodynamic age, but he hasn't really sort of laid out or explained what the connection is. And I think that's what he's going to do in the next paragraph if we want to go on to that one.
I can go again. Okay. It is therefore natural that in machines, the advent of the use of information channels that are distinct from energy channels caused a very profound change in the philosophy of technics. This advent was conditioned by the development of the vehicles of information, and in particular of low current signals. This is what we call electric currents, considered not as energy carriers, but as vehicles for information. Electric current as a vehicle for information is equal only to Hertz waves or a light beam, which also consists of electromagnetic waves like Hertz waves. Because electric current and electromagnetic waves have in common both an extreme speed of transmission and the ability to be modulated with precision without noticeable inertia in frequency as well as in amplitude. Their ability to be modulated makes them faithful carriers of information, and their speed of transmission makes them rapid carriers. What then becomes important is no longer the power conveyed, but the accuracy and fidelity of the modulation transmitted by the information channel. Beyond the dimensions defined by thermodynamics, a new category of physical dimensions emerges that makes it possible to classify information channels and compare them. This elaboration of new concepts has a particular sense for philosophical thought because it provides the examples of new values which, until this day, made no sense in technics, though they made sense in human thought and behavior. Thermodynamics had thus defined the notion of efficiency for a conversion system such as an engine. The efficiency is the ratio between the amount of energy at the inlet of the engine and the amount of energy collected at the outlet. Between the inlet and the outlet, there is a change in the form of energy. For example, in the case of the heat engine, thermal energy becomes mechanical energy. Since we know the mechanical equivalent of a calorie, we can define the efficiency of an engine as a transformer of thermal energy into mechanical energy. In every device that performs a conversion, we can more generally define an efficiency that is the ratio between two energies. There is thus the efficiency of the furnace, which is the ratio between the amount of chemical energy contained in the fuel system and the amount of heat actually released. The efficiency of the furnace boiler system, defined by the ratio between the caloric energy produced by the furnace and the thermal energy effectively transmitted to the water in the boiler. There is an energy efficiency. There is an engine efficiency. That is the ratio between the energy contained in the system that is constituted by the hot steam sent to the inlet and by the cold sink in the condenser, and the mechanical energy effectively produced by the steam expansion in the cylinder, a theoretical efficiency governed by the Carnot principle. In a series of energy transformations, the efficiency calculated between the first energy input and the last energy output is the product of all partial efficiencies. This principle applies even when the energy collected in the output is of the same nature as that at the inlet. When a storage battery is being charged, there is an initial partial efficiency, which is the conversion of electrical energy into chemical energy. When discharging it, there is a second partial efficiency, which is that of the conversion of chemical energy into electrical energy. The output of the battery is the product of these two efficiencies. However, when an information channel is used to transmit information, or when information is recorded onto a medium for storage purposes, or when there is a transfer from one information medium to another medium, for example, from mechanical vibrations to an alternating current in which the frequencies and amplitudes follow the vibrations, a loss of information occurs. What is collected at the outlet is not identical to what was at the inlet.
So I was wrong. It wasn't in this paragraph. He's going to take a more roundabout route to get there. But yeah, so he's contrasting here the idea of energy efficiency and information degradation, I guess you could say, or information fidelity. Okay, so we can continue then, I suppose. I think this paragraph was fairly clear. So I'll read the next one. For example, if one wants to transmit a current of acoustic frequencies through an information channel that is a telephonic circuit, one notes that some frequencies are correctly transmitted. For these, the modulation collected at the outlet is identical to that which was put in at the input of the circuit. But the bandwidth of the telephone circuit is narrow. If one enters a noise or a complex sound at the entrance to this channel, a considerable deformation ensues. The modulation collected at the outlet is not at all comparable to that which was entered at the input. It consists in an impoverishment of the former. For example, the fundamental frequencies of complex sounds between 200 Hz and 2000 Hz are transmitted correctly, but deprived of their upper harmonics. Or once again, the circuit introduces a harmonic distortion, which is to say that a sinusoidal sound that was entered at the input is no longer represented by a sinusoidal tension at the outlet. Despite their apparent difference, by the way, the two phenomena are the same. A circuit that introduces a harmonic distortion is an information channel with a narrow bandwidth that would transmit, without appreciable distortion, a sound that has the same frequency at the input as that of the harmonic component which appears at the outlet, even though it wasn't at the input, which is something that can occur when the circuit has a resonance at this harmonic frequency. A perfect information channel would provide all the modulations, however rich or complex they may be at the outlet, as have been put in at the input. One could attribute to this information channel an efficiency equal to 1, as one would attribute to a perfect engine. I'm going to continue with the next paragraph as well. These efficiency characteristics of information channels are not energy characteristics, and very often good information efficiency goes hand in hand with low energy efficiency. An electromagnetic loudspeaker has better energy efficiency than an electrodynamic loudspeaker, but very poor information output. This fact is fairly well explained if one considers that in a transformation system, the best energy efficiency is obtained when there is a tight coupling of two elements by a sharp resonance. A transformer whose coil capacitances are in tune with a certain frequency has an excellent primary-secondary coupling for this frequency, but it has a poor coupling for the other frequencies. It therefore transmits this frequency selectively, which causes a considerable signal loss when it is being used for broadband transmission. The energy output of a transformer designed to transmit information is lower, but constant for a wide frequency band. Energy efficiency and information output are thus two dimensions that are not linked to each other. The technician is often obliged to sacrifice one of the two outputs to obtain the other. Form is what is essential in information channels, and the conditions of its correct transmission are very different than those of high efficiency energy transmission. The resolution of problems related to information channels calls for an attitude that's different in spirit to that which is appropriate for problem solving in applied thermodynamics. A technician of thermodynamics tends towards gigantism in constructions and large-scale effects, because thermodynamic efficiency increases with the size of engines and installations. It is certainly possible to construct a small-scale steam engine, but its efficiency is low. Even if it is very well constructed, it cannot attain an excellent efficiency because heat loss and the importance of mechanical friction significantly come into play. The turbine is a system for the transformation of thermal energy into mechanical energy, which offers a better efficiency than that of a reciprocating engine. But if a turbine is to function properly, it requires a large installation. The efficiency of 3 small thermal power plants is lower than that of a single power plant with the same power as the 3 small ones together. This increase in efficiency with the size of the involved machines is a general and practical law of energetics that exceeds the framework of thermodynamics, strictly speaking. An industrial electric transformer generally has a higher efficiency than one with a nominal power of 50 watts. However, this tendency is much less pronounced within new forms of energy, such as electrical energy, than within the old ones, such as heat. Nothing would stand in the way of constructing a small-scale, high-output electric transformer. If the efficiency of low-power devices is somewhat neglected, then this is because the loss of output is less important for them than for industrial devices. Heat, in particular, is more easily dissipated for the same reasons that a small steam engine has a lower efficiency than a large one. Actually, I think I'll just read the last paragraph as well, because it looks like it's continuing the reasoning of the previous two. On the contrary, the information technician is brought in to find the smallest possible dimensions compatible with the residual thermodynamic requirements of the devices he uses. Information, effectively, is all the more useful in a regulation process in that it intervenes without delay, since the increase in size of information machines or transmission devices increases inertia and transit time. The stylus of the telegraph has become too heavy. A cable can transmit far more signals than the stylus can print. A single cable could carry traffic of 30 simultaneous calls. In an electronic tube, the time of transit for electrons between cathode and anode is responsible for a cutoff of high frequencies. The smallest electronic tube is the one that can reach the highest frequencies, but this same tube then has a very low power, because its small size does not allow it to evacuate enough heat without reaching a temperature that would compromise its functioning. It is possible that one of the causes of the tendency towards size reduction, which we have witnessed since 1946, lies in the discovery of this imperative of information techniques. to build technical individuals, and above all, elements of a very small size, because they are more perfect and have better information output. So he's contrasting information transmission from energy efficiency, contrasting information transmission and energy efficiency with respect to their tendencies on the size of technical objects. So thermal energy, or sorry, the optimization of energy efficiency tends to motivate increasingly large technical objects, so giant power plants and turbines and so on, whereas the optimization of information transmission will tend to lead to smaller and smaller technical objects, and this has only increased since the time that he's writing, with the introduction of transistors and microchips, and the constant progression of smaller and smaller chips.
It's a very interesting relationship between the size and the efficiency, and the kind of two eras, the one which valued energy transfer more, and the one which values information transfer or signal transfer more, I guess. And the various different psychosocial correlations which that involves. It's definitely a lot of different topics he's kind of putting into the technology bubble, which is a good idea, I think, to do, and perfectly plausible as well, that these would be key relevant factors. So
yeah, so again, he's continuing this sort of roundabout route to we're going to get eventually to what the link is between the ideology of technocracy and the prevalence of these thermal machines. I guess it's going to be in the next section that we won't have time to get to today. But I think, I can't remember the details of it, but what it looks like, what he's pointing to here is in the thermodynamic era, you don't have the separate information channel, which means that the tendency will be towards bigger and bigger machines, so giant steam engines and turbines and so on, which means that the cost or the decision making will be beyond the capacity of the individual technician or engineer or whoever. So the people that have the technical knowledge of the functioning of the machine won't have the power to implement their technical knowledge. And so that this ideology that they should have that power, that says, the engineers should have control over society, will develop in that context. Whereas in the later developments, when you have the use of information transmission in a separate channel from the energy channel, because it motivates smaller machines and smaller technical objects, you won't have that same tendency towards the technocratic ideology, because you have the people with technical knowledge can become amateur radio hobbyists or whatever other you can have technology at the scale of an individual that has the knowledge.
So it's kind of the evaluation of the regulative ideal in that domain of technical object is reflective of that same kind of psychosocial circumstance for the human subject, and that is relevant to that milieu.
Yeah, I think because in the thermodynamic era, that regulative function is sort of externalized from the machine. It means that the human operator is still has the function of performing that regulation, whereas in the electrical era, or when you have the separate information channel, the machine has its own self-regulation. So the human operator, you don't need that human operator to perform the regulation. So it has a different integration. The machine is integrated in a different way into society, or the human operator is integrated in a different way into the technical ensemble.
It's interesting. I feel for the first time probably that there's a certain kind of open-endedness to this question that is somehow unresolved, which is much different than my attitude about everything else, which seemed to fit perfectly with what was before it. But I'm going to have to kind of see how this expands into the technocratic attitude, etc. As this goes on. I'll be interested to see how this works out. It's very exciting.
Yeah, he leaves us on a bit of a cliffhanger in this section, because we don't have the resolution of what that relation between the ideology and the technical reality is. So we'll have to wait for next time. Tune in next week to hear the resolution. So unless there are any other comments, maybe that would be a good place to stop, since we're at the end of the section and we're almost at 2 hours. All right. So thank you everyone for participating this week, and hope to see you next week as well. All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.